Assalamu alaikum, Afsan. How's it going?
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you, Sheikh? You okay?
I'm not bad, alhamdulillah. How are you looking after England?
England is, as you know, it's unique, isn't it?
Alhamdulillah.
Doing things. How was Eid, Sheikh?
It was very good, alhamdulillah. Very good, alhamdulillah. Okay.
Sheikh, do you know where I could find some more information about the definition of Sahaba, where I could look at all the different views in the early phases of Islam about it?
Definitions of Sahaba as in the fuqaha.
Amongst the muhaddithin, how did they define who was a Sahabi and who wasn't?
I'm trying to think of other accessible or useful. Let me try and find something a bit more useful. But I mean, generally, there's a book Al-Isaba by Ibn Hajar.
Sahaba, yeah.
I'm not sure if he has a very long introduction.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine in his introduction he would deal with some of those things.
Okay.
It's an usul al-fiqh, but I don't know of like any kind of key place where we'd be like, oh yeah, here this book particularly mentions it in a very clear way and deals with all the key issues. So from what I recall from Sheikh Ahmed Snowbird is that there is a little glitch in that we generally proving that somebody is a Sahabi is usually done through the criterion of history and not the criterion of hadith proper. So that means that somebody in principle could be labeled as a Sahabi with less evidence than it would be needed to prove a hadith. And then in principle, by virtue of them being a Sahabi, suddenly we would accept their hadiths even though they are not a tabi'i, so without really knowing whether or not they're a thiqah. And then in principle, the hadith would be sahih even though it's not. Practically speaking, that doesn't happen. Like practically speaking, it's like a non-issue. There's a key debate, like I know where is it? A key debate among the Sahaba themselves. I believe it was with Ma'qil ibn Yasar. He claimed he made a claim. He said, "Yeah, I heard the Prophet say that," and the Sahaba were like, "Well, who are you anyway?" Basically. So I don't know. I don't know where that would come up, where that comes up exactly. But basically, it being a major issue, like, based on this definition or that definition, we have huge fiqh discussions. I don't think that's the case at all. Like, I don't think that we have those issues. Certainly for the usuliyin, and again, I can't think of a particular work that deals with it. I mean, all works in usul will deal with it in detail, but specifically, like really like key nuggets of information, they definitely deal with this issue of the fiqh as-sahabi. If we say that we can do taqleed of the Sahaba, what do we mean? Who do we mean?
Yeah, because remember we did
the issue of the mawquf hadith.
We did shurut al-a'imma al-khamsa, and when we did the madars of hadith, he referred in his footnotes to Kitab al-Ilal of Ali ibn Madini. If you look in Kitab al-Ilal of Madini, after he deals with the madars and the succession after the madar, these people, the six, their knowledge is distilled into these 12, and then the 12 into three. Then at the end, he then talks about the companions and says, these are the fuqaha amongst the companions, and then you realize that obviously they traveled away from Medina and settled in different regions, and then they had students, etc. But it'd just be interesting to see a discussion about, how did they kind of know who was a Sahabi and who wasn't? and that
Yeah, so I mean,
yeah,
it would come down to like shuhra and history, you know, again, like what's kind of well known, but the issue is it's not a significant thing. You know,
yeah,
given that, for example, we don't, you know, we don't treat, you know, the khabar al-ahad is not treated absolutely anyway, and the Sahaba criticize hadith that they heard from other Sahaba anyway, so that let alone if it came from somebody who they didn't even know about, as again with the scenario of Ma'qil ibn Yasar. So it's, you know, to say, for example, that there were these, you know, a whole group of people that kind of like slipped into the ranks of the Sahaba and suddenly became relevant. Like, it's not really a big deal. What's more relevant, it was who were, let's say in fiqh specifically, who were the big shots. So what's more relevant really in fiqh is who are the, for example, who were the big fuqaha of the Sahaba and Tabi'een, right?
yeah. So that's why there's
That's
always
more important than who was a
yeah.
Sahabi or not. So the fatwa, for example, of, I don't know, one Sahabi that, you know, Julayli, for example, is no way as irrelevant as something like the fatwa of you know, I'm talking about relevant in terms of a proof for us today, and relevant just historically, just as the structure of fiqh, as for example the fatwa of something like Ibrahim al-Nakhai or Sa'id al-Musayyib, right?
Yeah. And I guess it's important to know who the fuqaha of the Sahaba are, because then you can trace back the rulings of especially, you know, the Maliki and the Hanafi school back to those fuqaha.
But even so where would you see this? So here, without actually going through an exhaustive list, you can look in, for example, the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba or Musannaf Abdul Razzaq. Who are they quoting? Or Muwatta Imam Malik, Muwatta Imam Muhammad, make it a bit easier, right? Smaller works. Who are they actually quoting? Like when you get to the end of it, who are they even referencing? Ibn Hazm has an essay on this. It's just a list in reality. I can't remember what it's called, but he has like a list of like the fuqaha or something like that, and or fuqaha al-Sahaba. I'll try and find it. It's just a list. So what's interesting is on the top of the list is Aisha radiallahu anha. She's actually number one.
So do you think if you, for example, if you understand who the fuqaha of the Sahaba are, say for example, you know that Abdullah ibn Masud was in Kufa, and you know you had the, you know, the likes of you know, other Sahaba in Medina, then you'll start to understand why, you know, there was a difference and it's variation
and sometimes it's blatantly obvious. Like sometimes it's very, very simple. It's like, why is it this is the Hanafi school or this is the Maliki / Shafi / Hanbali school? Why is there a difference? These fuqaha versus those fuqaha. Like often, you know, this was shakhs, you know, proper observation, which is true and completely is that basically we have these local fiqhs, and it was like this, you know, the fuqaha of that place, they said these positions, and there we go. So we have Sahaba Tabi'in of this locality, they said this, that's why it's a Hanafi school today. We have the you know, the fuqaha and Sahaba Tabi'in of that locality, they said that's why there's this position today, and another madhab. Like it's on some levels it's really obvious, very, very clear. It's like, you know, if you just went through a hadith of Abdullah Mas'ud and Fatawa Abdullah Mas'ud, and a hadith of Abdullah ibn Umar and Fatawa of Abdullah ibn Umar, and just, you know, like say 10, 20 of them, and then compare it to, for example, the Maliki school or the Hanbali, you know, whatever schools you want to look at, it's very easy to see, okay, Hanafi school goes with this, Maliki school goes with that. You know, how many times, for example, does Imam Malik quote Ibrahim al-Nakhai? Never.
He hardly read quotes,
he hardly even quotes Sayyidina Ali. Right? It's rare. Or
is it correct to say that he virtually avoids any rawis from Iraq at all?
Yeah, he didn't like them. He didn't like Iraq.
Yeah, he seems to avoid it so completely.
Which is, and that was his thing. His thing is Medina is the place. And so, you know, Medina, and when he heard that Layth ibn Sa'd went against some of the fatwa of the Medina scholars, he wrote a very, very, very polite and respectful letter to him saying, no, don't do that. Follow the way of Medina, right? And you know, and so that it's very obvious. right? It's very obvious in, you know, in when we look at the, you know, so you just, you know, open Quduri and open Musannaf ibn Shaybah or Musannaf al-Razaq, and you just see the connections. Be like, Ibrahim Nakhai said this, oh, this is in Quduri. So Abdullah Mas'ud said this, oh, this is in Quduri. It's not always the case, because Imam Abu Hanifa is not a muqallid, so he doesn't, you know, necessarily agree with every single thing that the big shuyukh of his tradition said, and he is critical and he's aware of what the Meccans say and aware of what the Medinas say, etc. And also there is, you know, Imam Muhammad as well and Abu Yusuf, etc. But there is it's very obvious. Right, it happens, and then we have some things in between, like Imam Ahmad. Generally, Imam Ahmad is coming from Imam Shafi, and Imam Shafi is coming out of Imam Malik. That's a general tack, but it's not all the time. Sometimes it would be like very clear that Imam Ahmad on this scenario is exactly with the Hanafis. Why? Because they're both going back to the same Sahabi. In this particular scenario, Imam Ahmad went against the you know, or Imam Shafi as well went against the one tradition, took from the other tradition, right? But it's very clear, you know, it's very clear that to understand where they're coming from, we have to look at these fatwa, right? And particularly, it's very clear for, you know, I'm trying to understand where on earth does Hanafi fiqh come from, because you know, it's Shafi fiqh. Arguably, in many scenarios, not all scenarios, but many scenarios, it's like, oh, there's the hadith. You know, for example, in one of our key mutun, you know, in Shafi fiqh, Matan Abi Shuja', a lot of the time it's copy and paste from a famous hadith. Like the matan in fiqh is the hadith. It's the same thing, you know, and it's like, it's kind of understandable, and you can understand, okay, they went against here, fine, but sometimes I'm reading Hanafi fiqh or Maliki fiqh, and I'm like, I just don't understand where you guys are coming from. Like, why did you even say this sentence? Why did you even have these ideas? And then you just simply open up those works and you see Fatawa, Sahaba, Tabi'een, and then particularly in that locality, and you'll be like, oh, it makes sense now. Where does it even come from? Right? And then again, also the Kitab al-Athar by Imam Muhammad, Kitab al-Athar by Abu Yusuf. What else? You know, and so you'll find these things, but all groups are affected by Sayyid Abu Bakr and Umar. So Abu Bakr and Umar are quoted by both groups, and even Imam Muhammad in the Muwatta, he will use what Imam Malik quotes from Sayyidina Umar to disprove Imam Malik and to prove Imam Abu Hanifa. So it's not, it's like, for them, it's like, you know, both are a proof, you know. Ibn Abbas is quoted by most people as well, because he's just a big fiqhi. He's a Meccan proper, and he's you know, his school is really the Meccan school, but the Meccan school kind of died out, so he's quoted by everybody really. He's a, you know, but it's you know, and so going back to your point, okay, I need to have a list who's a fiqhi and who's not a fiqhi. Number one, the fuqaha, they don't do taqleed to that level. So they don't want to have a list like who's a thiqah, who's not. So with a thiqah, like, all I can do is listen to what you say, right? So I need to know, I have a list, are you a thiqah or not, right? But as a fuqaha, they don't do taqleed to that level. So they're not like, oh, well, Ibn Abbas said it, therefore it's true, right? And so they have, you know, so they're you know, the fingers are, you know, the level of criticism is a bit higher, so they don't need to like know exactly, are you on this list of, you know, 122 names or not? It's not like that, you know. It's the key people are few. You know, the big shots are few. You'll hear other names here and then quoted that aren't that familiar, but you know, but you know, and Bukhari as well will quote them. You know, quoting Hassan al-Basri, quoting, you know, other people like that, Ibn Sirin, etc. And then it's not unknown. Right? I'm trying to think of other works, like I believe Shirazi, Abu Ishaq Shirazi of the Shafi'is, he has a book called Tabaqat al-Fuqaha as well. Right? So it's like Tabaqat Muhaddithin, Tabaqat al-Fuqaha. But again, it's not like, are you on the list or not? It's not that accurate. And the main people are known. You know, the people are known. Allahu alam. Does that help?
Yeah, Jazakallah khairan. I apologize if I'm taking too
not at all. We just have Aban starting to make mini du'as against you. That's all.
Yeah, subhanallah.
Just joking. Okay, so Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalam ala sayyidil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una wanfa'na bima tu'allimuna wazidna bi fadlika an ta'liman innaka ala kulli shay'in qadir. So last week we did the gharib. We said we're going to come back to it. So it's a kind of a bit of a nebulous term, gharib, as you mentioned, because it means something odd, but it could be just something sahih, or it could be oddness that is actually problematic, and we'll explain that later on. And then we've got musalsal is a non-discussion really. So he says, the author, may Allah show him tremendous mercy, he says, well, musalsal, the serial hadith that comes in series, ما كان سنده على صفة واحدة في طبقاته, that each level has the same something particular is happening to each level of hadith. كما سلسل بسمعت أو كما سلسل بالأولية إلى سفيان. For example, when you say, the first hadith that I heard from my teacher was this, and the first hadith that he heard from his teacher was this, and it goes up to Sufyan al-Thawri, for example. What's the significance? Nothing. So for example, they have it's a kind of a thing that muhaddithin do. The first hadith you hear is, here it says, for example, وَالْمُسَلْسَلْ إِلَى سُفْيَانِ ibn عُيَيْنَةَ عن عمرو بن دينار عن أبي قابوس مولى عبد الله بن عمرو بن عاص عن عبد الله بن عاص رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الراحمون يرحمهم الرحمن تبارك وتعالى ارحموا من في الأرض يرحمكم من في السماء. Right? So this is often the first hadith that people will narrate, from their teacher, for example, but it's just kind of like tafannun. It's like a game, a nice thing to do. It has nothing to do with actual hadith criticism whatsoever. Right? He says ثم بتقدير one second. I skipped something. Yeah, I skipped something. Where is it? والمسلسل إلى سفيان إلى where was it? He says وعامة المسلسلات واهية. Many of these kind of cool things you're going to have. The first, I noted the hadith, and my sheikh paid 2 rakahs and then narrated the hadith to me. He says, it's like whatever. It's like things you find. Right? عامة المسلسلات واهية. They're very extremely weak. وأكثره باطلة لكذب رواتها. وأقواها المسلسل بقراءة سورة الصف والمسلسل بالدمشقيين والمسلسل بالمصريين والمسلسل محمدين إلى ابن شهاب الزهري. محمد ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. Muhammad ibn Muslim. Right? So the people, so-and-so from Muhammad narrates from so-and-so called Muhammad, etc. It's kind of just, but it's not an actual thing about hadith criticism. And it says وَالْمُعَنْعَنْ. So it says مَا إِسْنَادُهُ فُلَانَ عَنْ فُلَانَ. Right, so this is problematic. Why? Problematic because so-and-so is a thiqah, and he says an, which is not clear. Does an mean via, or does an mean via directly via somebody? Right, so it's not a clear thing. So there's a problem. فمن الناس من يقول لا يثبت حتى يصح لقاء الراوي بشيخه يوما ما. Right, so basically, when Aban says, I narrate via Farid, we have to make sure that actually Aban at some point in his life actually narrated a hadith from me. Right? Now, in reality, this is it's a big discussion because Muslim put it in the beginning of his work and made a big deal about it. It's not really practically a big issue at all. Right? So we're going to discuss it today in today's lesson. Inshallah, we'll finish it. But practically speaking, it's not a big issue. Right? It's not a big issue. What is a big issue is al-mursal al-khafi. Mursal al-khafi is a big issue, a subtle issue, which is what? Which is Aban didn't narrate hadiths from Farid, but didn't narrate this hadith from Farid, and it's not clear. Right? And so that's a bigger problem, and that's to do with the ilal. Right? And it's very, very difficult to find. And sometimes the kings of ilal try and find it, but still evades them. Right? It's a very difficult thing to deal with. Anyway, so it says some people. So theoretically, on a theoretical level, it's a big issue, and and sometimes again, things become big which aren't big. Right? Because somebody says this, then someone says that, and someone says this, and someone says that. Some of these issues are fundamental and huge. Others are not fundamental and huge. And this is what we find across the, across the disciplines. So here, this is really not a practical thing. The debate it's not an issue that really comes up when I'm critiquing a hadith. Oh, am I following this manhaj or that manhaj? It's not really a big deal, right? But the whole issue of is this connected or not, and what's actually being said, and is this accurate? Did this person actually hear this hadith from this person, or is there someone in between them that I'm trying to find out? That is a big deal. Right? So it says some people say that it's not, if it's so and so, it says fulan and fulan, then I have to make sure that fulan actually narrated from someone else at a certain time, right? And so what we'll find, for example, in the Tarikh al-Kabir of Bukhari, is he'll have a chain transmission saying so and so narrates from so and so. You're like, well, what was the point in that? Why didn't he even mention it? He just mentions a chain transmission. That's it. What he's trying to do is trying to prove to you that so and so at one point did actually say sami'tu, right? And so, for example, the issue between Hassan al-Basri and Abu Hurairah. Did Hassan al-Basri ever actually hear any hadith from Abu Hurairah? Generally speaking, no, but there is some evidence that he said yes, that he did actually say haddathana, right? The debate then, that actually, like, Abu Hurairah told us. The issue then is this particularly a term that Hassan al-Basri used, meaning like, his teachers, or sorry, his students narrated to us, right? Which is problematic as well. But that's the issue. Did this person actually narrate from that person or not, right? At all, right? So in principle, for Imam Bukhari and those of that madhab, and certain people ascribe to that school, they said what we need to do is whenever so and so says an, which is very common, that's not a problem, but somewhere down the line, somewhere in history, in the life of this narrator, they have to have narrated from that person. So we're going to have to find somewhere where he actually says sami'tu or haddathana or haddathani, etc. Right? ومنهم من اكتفى. Go ahead.
Yeah, is it that when they say Anan, you said that at a point people were narrating hadith based on like, in a sense, a sort of paraphrasing and emphasizing on the meaning. So when they say Sami'atu or Hadasna, I think is that an indication more toward that they're not doing that? And when they say Anan, like it's a more of an indicator that they're doing that, or is there no correlation?
It's possible. It's possible. So generally, if we look at different chains, you'll find the same chain in different books with different wordings. So, for example, you pick up the Muqidha, it never says haddathana. So the whole Muqidha always says an. Everything says an. But yet that same hadith, for example, we look at the Yahya Laythi's narration of it, or al-Qa'nabi's narration of it, and then we find that same hadith from Qa'nabi in Bukhari with haddathana or something like that, right? Or akhbarana. And so the issue is that basically certain scholars at certain times are paraphrasing and are not making a big deal about it, because most of the time it's not. For example, let's say, I'm dealing with the Muwatta. The issue of tadlis and mu'ana'ana and irsal khafi in the Muwatta is fairly insignificant, because there isn't much of that happening in Medina anyway. Whereas in Kufa and Basra and these kind of things, it is more of a problem. Generally speaking, it's more of a problem. So you will find that certain hadith critics of that time of Imam Malik or before and thereafter, are being really, really careful with exactly what was the phrase, and dealing with the gathering different chains to try and find exactly the phrase used by different hadith narrators. And that Imam Dhahabi is going to mention as well that later scholars didn't really care about it as well, and so you're going to find that it's kind of pointless later on. But so there was a certain period where there were certain problems identified, and so people were very, very careful about these terms. And we find that, for example, with Nasa'i, who is a hadith critic, he himself was very, very careful with the terms that he used. And I think it's Harith ibn Miskin, or Miskin ibn Harith, I can't remember his name. He will always say akhbarana. He'll always say akhbarana. Why? He has this particular term, he informed us. specifically. Why? Because he was in Egypt. He had a conflict with this narrator, and the narrator didn't like him. So he used to secretly attend the majalis, and he wouldn't be seen. So he didn't want to say, he told me, as if it was like some kind of person. He wanted to just say, he told us, right? And made it very kind of careful in that way that, I'm not saying that I actually heard it. He wasn't telling me or something like that. So they're very, very careful because they themselves suffered or had to deal with the annoyance and the difficulty of vagueness of words that people use. He wanted to use very, very clear terms so that when people critiqued his own hadiths, and so they knew exactly what was going on, right? And so it's a particular, it's just people dealing with a particular problem. So they were very particular about the words used. Later scholars didn't really care, and they will use whatever terms that are there. We're going to see what Dhahabi says about that. And earlier, do we find that, for example, the tabi'in saying that حدثنا Abu Hurairah an Abu Hurairah سمعت Abu Hurairah? Sometimes you have very specific words. Sometimes it's not there at all. But the issue is, just trying to deal with this problem. So the same thing applies to the word anna as well. That we see that quite frequently in the Muqidha. There will be inqita in a so and so like so and so will say that Umar said this. Sa'id will say that Umar ibn Khattab said. So there's a gap there. He said that he said it. He didn't say that he heard him say it. Right? And that's quite common. Anyway, so the issue here, just as theoretical thing, is what? Do we have to have ithbat al-liqa or not? Right? He says, وَهُوَ مَذْهَبْ مُسْلِمٍ وَقَدْ بَالَغَ فِي الرَّدِّ عَلَى مُخَالِفِهِ. And so in the book, Muslim's introduction to his book, he made a big deal about this, and he said, whoever said you have to, whenever a thiqa says an, then it's understood that it's connected, and you don't have to prove that case at all. And if you were to make that stipulation, then we have to cancel out many Sahih hadiths, and this is really ridiculous, and this is completely wrong, etc. So because of the importance of this discussion on a theoretical level, not really on a practical level, our editor, Sheikh Muhammad Awama, not Sheikh Muhammad Awama, Sheikh Abu Ghudda, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, he has a whole essay on this at the end of his book. So if you go to a page 119 of this book, you're going to see he has a whole essay on it. Thumbnails, where is it? I'm just going to pick out certain things. We can read the whole essay there, 119. The book isn't actually that long. Our book is going to end where? In another 40 pages. Another 45 pages. Right? But then the rest of it is a little essays. So this is on 119. Where is 119? Yeah.
And for anybody who knows anything about Islamic books, studies, they know how big of a deal books are, especially for people studying Islamic books.
Assalamu alaikum, Abdullah.
Alaikum salam.
How's it going? Did you just join?
Yes, yes.
Okay, ahlan sahlan.
Uh,
So it says on 119, he's going through this whole issue. Where is it? 119. 119. I think my pages are different to your pages. Where are these? It comes back, I think in here it comes before this. I think it's 117. Yeah, my print is slightly different. Here we go. 115 التتمة الثالثة في بيان مذهب إمام مالك في الحديث المعنعن بشرطه وبيان المعني بالنقد والرد في كلامه. So what does Muslim mean? Who is he actually criticizing? So that's what we're going to talk about. So we're just going to, so my pages are, so I wrote down a few pages to look at. My pages seem to be 4 pages different. So one second, let me just quickly do the maths so that I know which pages. So this is going to be 15. This is going to be 120, 125, 131, 131 plus 133 plus 135 type. So 115. So where is this? It's odd. It is 19, sorry, apologize. It is on page 119. So he gives some examples of people who narrate from people with the word an. Apologize, they're all right. I don't know why I got that wrong. Sorry. Okay, so 119, he gives some examples of people who narrate from others, but they're not known to have ever said, I heard them say anything. So here's an example. Abu Uthman al-Nahdi, right? Great hadith narrator. And Abu Rafi al-Sa'ir. وهما ممن أدرك الجاهلية, right? The مخضرمين, the people who are in the Jahiliyyah to begin with. وصاحب أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ونقل عنهم الأخبار. So they're تابعين, كبار التابعين. وقد أسند كل واحد منهما عن أبي بن كعب عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم حديثا ولم نسمع في رواية بعينها أنهما عاينا أبيا أو سمع منه شيئا. Right? So they both say, we have chain of transmission for both of them where it says Abu Uthman al-Nahdi an Ubay ibn Ka'b. But we don't have a single chain that ever says Sami'tu. So how do you know that Abu Uthman al-Nahdi actually heard this hadith from Ubay ibn Ka'b? And he didn't hear it from a tabi'i, for example. How do I know it's not mursal? How do I know there's not a gap in the chain? So if we apply the criterion of the other, I won't say Bukhari yet, but if we apply the one position, we would say, well, have you ever heard Abu Uthman al-Nahdi say that he heard directly Ubay ibn Ka'b say anything? No. Okay, then how do you know it's connected then? So therefore the hadith can be da'if. Whereas the other school says, well, it's fine. It's assumed to be fine until problematic, until otherwise, unless otherwise. And so, so we would look at someone like Abu Uthman Nahdi and say, Abu Uthman Nahdi, is he known to narrate from people in a way that seems like he directly narrated from them, but he didn't? Is he what we call a mudallis, which we'll talk about? And if not, then it's fine, right? So this is practically the issue. Whenever anybody says an, I check, did this person actually narrate from this person or not? And is he a mudallis or not? If he is a mudallis and it's not clear if he narrated from him or not, it's problematic, right? For example, Mansur an al-Sha'bi an Salama, right? Sha'bi an Salama. The issue is, did Sha'bi narrate from Salama or not? It's not clear. So the an is not enough. I need to dig a little bit more. It's not. It's a known problem. Did he narrate from Salama or not? Right. And so here again, you know, it would have a difference there. Another example here, Abu Amr al-Shaybani. Again, he's a tabi'i kabir, someone who's who was already old in the Sahih time there. وكان في زمن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم رجل, is a man already, right? Similar kind of thing, where he would do stuff like that. وأبو معمر كل واحد منهما عن أبي مسعود الأنصاري عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Same thing. You know, how do I know that or not? And it gives examples there on those pages. 124. The ones I'm going to point out here. So he says, وَقَوْلُ مُسْلِمٍ, i.e. that it's just fine. As long as you're not a mudallis and you say, and I'm going to assume you actually narrated from him, then that's fine. قَوْلُ مُسْلِمٍ الَّذِي ذَهَبَ إِلَيْهِ لَهُ وَجَاهَ وَقُوَّةٌ أشار إليه وعمل به غير واحد من كبار الحفاظ والنقاد. And practically speaking, you know, yes, there might be a debate. What is the relied upon position in theory? Practically speaking, is not an issue. Right? Practically speaking, this is what we apply, right, in hadith criticism. Right? So I, specifically asked the student of Sheikh Shu'aib al-Naud, who worked under Sheikh Shu'aib al-Naud in doing, on Musnad Ahmad and other works, and who finished after him the Musnad al-Hakim. Like, is this a practical problem? Like, is this debate really significant in, when you're actually doing a hukm on a hadith? He's like, no, it's not a big deal at all. So he says, for example, here, Ibn Hibban and many of the late scholars, so and وحكاه الحافظ Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali in his commentary on the al-Tirmidhi, he said, people have, it's all fine, and he said, فإنه بعد أن تعرض لشرح مذهب مسلم ومذهب علي بن مديني البخاري في الحديث معنا بشرطه ورجح مذهبهما وأطال في ترجيحه. وقال رحمه الله he says وكثير من العلماء المتأخرين على ما قاله مسلم رحمه الله تعالى من أن إمكان اللقي كاف. إمكان اللقي, it's just possible that you were alive at the same time. You were alive at the same time, you were in the same places, fine. He says كاف في الاتصال من الثقة غير أو غير المدلس. غير المدلس نعت, غير المدلس حال. So the issue with غير, the i'rab of غير after ma'rifah, is that غير is what we call متولغ في الإبهام. It's a word that can't become definite. So how can a word that can't become definite, like غير, be a na'at for a ma'rifah like thiqa? So the condition in a na'at is that you have the na'at and the sif and the mawsuf, or the na'at man'ut, they have both be ma'rifah or both be nakira, right? And so the issue, so how could it be, how could غير be a sifa for a thiqa, even though it's ma'rifah, right? So the answer is that it could be a sifa because you're either a mudallis or you're not. There is a dichotomy. You're either this or you're that. And so when I say غير مدلس, then it's not mubham anymore. It's definitely you are now غير مدلس or mudallis, right? So you're one of the two. And so because it has this dichotomy, and in any scenarios that you say, for example, قال بالحق غير الباطل, right? So the haqq or the batil, you have a dichotomy, one or the other, right? As opposed to when I say جاء رجل غير زيد, so a man other than Zayd came. So the word غير زيد can describe rajul, because rajul is nakira, and غير, even though it's mudaf to a ma'rifah, it's still nakira because it means anybody other than Zayd, which is still kind of very general, right? But usually we'd say غير المدلس, right? For example, هذا for example, أحب الطعام غير الحار, or for example, أحب الطعام غير الإنجليزي, right? I like non-English food, right? And so غير الإنجليزي is not, could be anything. And so you're going to say, فقدم له الطعام غير الإنجليزي. It's going to be a حال, أي مغايرا للإنجليزي, right? because why? In which case you have at-ta'amu, which is ma'rifa, and the na'at cannot be nakira, and so what we're going to have to say, make it a hal instead, because a hal is nakira. Okay, but here he's made it specifically, and Sheikh Abdul Fattah al-Ghudda, people of that tabaqa, they're all متبحرين في العلوم كلها, and so he made this, he cleared this dabt here, putting a kasra on it and not a fatha, right? So وهو ظاهر كلام ابن حبان وغيره. وقد ذكر الترمذي من كتاب العلم أن سماع سعيد المسيب من أنس ممكن لكن لم يحكم برواية عنه بالاتصال, etc. And he mentions other things there, and so that goes on. Who said yes? Who said no? So that's 124, 129 now, or is it 129? Similarly, حافظ ذهبي ومنه الحافظ ذهبي في الموقظة, we're looking here, إذ قال حديث معنا من الناس, etc. He says that. ومنهم ابن حجر, so he says الوجه الخامس, Ibn Hajar in his مقدمة of Bukhari, he says والوجه الخامس من وجوه تفضيل البخاري على مسلم أن مسلما كان مذهبه على ما صرح به في مقدمة صحيحه وبالغ في الرد على من خالفه أن الإسناد المعنعن له حكم الاتصال إذا تعاصر المعنعن من ومن عنعن عنه. So they're at the same times تعاصر وإن لم يثبت, right? والأولى نعم والأولى إن لم يعلم اجتماعهما إلا إن كان unless it's a معنعن مدلس, والبخاري لا يحمل ذلك على الاتصال حيث حتى يثبت اجتماعهما ولو مرة. He says وهذا مما ترجح به كتابه لأن وإن سلمنا ما ذكره مسلم من حكم الاتصال فلا يخفى أن شرط البخاري أوضح في الاتصال. So he said, so Ibn Hajar says, why is Bukhari better than Muslim? He says Bukhari is better than Muslim is that both of them are good, and even though we accept Muslim's position that yes, if a thiqa says an, then it's assumed to be that he narrated directly from him and he heard the hadith directly from him, even if it's not established he ever said sami'tu or haddathana or whatever, it's fine. He says because Bukhari is more careful, and that's the reality of the case. Bukhari is simply being more careful. Bukhari, as we'll learn, is not saying the hadith is weak. Okay, is everybody following?
So Bukhari is just saying to help me determine that it's ittisal, I just need another hadith where I know in the transmission.
One chain transmission where this person said, I heard this person. Okay. He narrated to me. That's all. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So now the question is, so here what we see from Ibn Hajar is that the debate is between two people, Bukhari and Muslim. Now the problem is that Muslim is a student of Bukhari. The other problem is that the language and the criticism used by Muslim is extremely strong, right? And so here, this is what we find at the mastery of Sheikh Abdul Fattah al-Ghudda. He mentions this issue at the end. He says, who is Muslim actually criticizing? So this helps us to understand two things. Why is he using this language? Number one, and number two, what is Bukhari's madhab actually, right? And so where is it? So I want to go now to page 135. So he says here. So he mentions, mentioned his discussions with various scholars. He says, I was discussing who was saying, who was actually being intended, who was Imam Muslim talking to, right? So he mentions before that he mentions his history of who is Muslim and when did he say this, when did he say that, and why is he using the words. And then he says at the top, he says, قلت لشيخنا حبيب الرحمن الأعظمي, right? He's passed away a long time ago, but he edited many works. He edited the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq. He edited the Musannaf Humaydi and various works, al-A'zami. He says, لما سألته عنه وأجاب أنه Bukhari. I asked him, he said, it's definitely Bukhari. And I said, well, it's a bit far-fetched, isn't it? Like, how could a Muslim who spent such a long time with his Shaykh Bukhari and said such nice things, how could he like speak in this kind of way? He said, he says, قال هكذا غضبات المحدثين ولو مع شيوخهم. So that's what muhaddithin are like. Muhaddithin, they're a bit hardcore. What can you do, right? It says وكذلك كان قول شيخنا عبد الله ibn صديق صديق. I'm not sure. I believe it's Siddiq. It could be Sadiq al-Ghumari. And so when we say al-Ghumari, there are various Ghumaris. So you have to always be careful which Ghumari we're talking about, right? So that there are a family of scholars, Moroccan scholars. Some of them are like hardcore. I think one of them is even Shi'i. One of those like extreme Sufi, extreme Salafi, and then some of them are moderate. حفظه الله تعالى وأمتع به حين لقيته بمكة المكرمة حاجة عن كذا ثم عدل عنه إلى ما اخترته وهو أن المعنى بكلام مسلم علي المديني. So so I asked Abdullah Sheikh, my teacher Umar. I said, listen, I had a discussion with him, and he was like, yeah, it's true. That doesn't make sense. It's actually Bukhari's teacher that's being intended here, and not Bukhari himself. And Bukhari's position is not actually that. Right? بعدما قرأت عليه مقدمة ما مسلم وأوقفته على كلام الحافظ ابن كثير. And so it's worth noting that this is real talaqqi. Right? Real talaqqi is not what's happening right now. Right now, I'm talking, you're listening. Real talaqqi is also not what happens when you have a question and I answer it. Real talaqqi is when me and you, the teacher and the student, bash heads. Right? And I say something, you say something, and we get out the books, and there's a point where the skill, the knack, the ability is transferred, right? That your teacher doesn't necessarily know everything, and that's in all sciences. He doesn't necessarily know everything, but you bring up the issues, and you go with him on the things, and you might agree or disagree. That's not the point. The point is there was this stage where you learnt how to navigate the problems in fiqh, in aqidah, in lugha, whatever it is, right? And you got to a point where it's like, aha, I know how this science works, right? So this is what we see here with this, on a certain level, but that's real talaqqi, right? This is what we have, for example, in certain of my lessons with my teachers, and what my teachers had with their teachers is real head-to-head. Right? It's not out of adab, sheikh, you say that, therefore you're true. That's not called ilm. That's not talaqqi. Talaqqi is when there's a head-to-head. Right? Imam Malik with Imam, really debating with Imam Shafi, really debating with Imam Malik, as opposed to, just hearing what you said. Right? And so this is a very important thing to note. Whenever you find any teacher, and he said he studied with so-and-so, what does that even mean, you studied with so-and-so? What did you do with that teacher? You just listened to him? Now, what does it mean? Like he sat there and listened to him for 20 years. That's not called talaqqi. Right? Talaqqi, that's relevant. It's obviously relevant, but talaqqi is you debated with that person, and he knew what you were thinking, and you knew what they were thinking, and you brought out your proofs and his proofs, and he saw that now you're there, you've reached, like you're not able to do this. We might agree, we might disagree. That's not the point. The point is you're on that level to do that. And that's what I saw again with one of my teachers in fiqh, Sheikh Abdul Rashid. He studied Shafi fiqh here in Jordan and in Syria, and he got his PhD in Shafi fiqh, and then he went to Yemen. That's when it all started. In Yemen, that's when he was debating, and he realized, hang on a minute, a lot of things I don't understand. And he sent messages. He had recorded many lessons here, and he just sent a message back to people who had to record. He said, just get rid of all those recordings, they're all wrong. And he spent 10 years going to lessons, debating, dealing with problems with his teachers, right? That's talaqqi, right? And so again, I go and ask him a question today. He doesn't know the answer sometimes. He's like, yeah, you guys look it up. That's why I remember. It's not that he's memorized this fact and that fact, but he has the knack and he has the malaka, he's cracked this science and he knows how to do it. Okay, type. Running out of time. Anyway, so he says, where was it? He says, ثم رأيت والحمد لله على توفيقه ما يؤيد ذلك من كلام العلماء المشهود لهم بالتحقيق والتنقيب معللا بدليل فرأيت الحافظ ابن كثير رحمه الله تعالى في كتابه اختصار علوم الحديث. And I don't know what that book is. اختصار علوم الحديث. باحث الحديث. I'm not sure if it's the same book. في مبحث النوع الحادية عشرة. أحد عشرة. Yeah. الحادية عشرة مبني. المعضل يقول قيل إنه يريد البخاري والظاهر أنه يريد علي المديني فإنه يشترط ذلك في أصل حديث الصحة. Right, this is the بيت القصيد. Key point. Ali al-Madini, he said a hadith is not sahih without this condition. أما البخاري فإنه لا يشترطه في أصل الصحة. Right, and this is a common debate here, and here that even Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani says that. So here we're going to have a difference agreement here between Ibn Kathir and Ibn Hajar on this issue. Ibn Hajar says, yeah, it's Bukhari stipulates that as a condition. Right, and so Ibn Kathir says Bukhari is not it's not a condition in theory. All he's doing is in his Sahih, he's making that he's adhering to that. He says, لكن التزم ذلك في كتابه الصحيح. So Sahih, he added this. He just he put the standards higher. That's all in the Sahih, but that's not actually. It's not saying that's actually a condition, right? ووافق الحافظ ابن حجر على قوله هذا واستظهاره الإمام فاعل شيخ الإسلام البلقيني. And there's more than one. This is Siraj Bulqini, Sheikh al-Hafiz al-Hajar في كتابه محاسن السلاح وتضمين كتاب الاصطلاح كذا كذا فقال etc. Right. So who is he talking about? It's talking about Ali al-Madini and not about his Sheikh. Right. That's 35, 37. Where is it? 38, sorry. He says, وَجَزَمَ أَنَّ الْمَعْنِيَّ, who's this? This is Ibn Qasim al-Ghazni, Shafi'i as well. جَزَمَ أَنَّ الْمَعْنِيَّ Ali al-Madini. Who was intended by this criticism? Ali al-Madini and not Bukhari. Oh, okay, apologize. Yeah, so الحافظ الحجر فقال قال تلميذه الحافظ البقاعي في النكت الوافية, etc. And using manuscripts here. He says, so our Sheikh was asked about this. Who did he intend? He said, who's he intending? He said, Ali al-Madini and not Bukhari. That's, and then, no, where is it? It's not 138, sorry, I want 138. 138, and so he's, was 138 here. So he says, that's because Bukhari, he didn't mean Bukhari, wasn't talking about Bukhari, he was talking about his Sheikh. Why did he not mean Bukhari? لأنه أي Bukhari توسط بين مذهب ابن المديني ومذهب مسلم في المسألة. Right, because Bukhari is in between. He didn't say it's perfectly fine, nor did he say it's a condition. He's saying that he's just being careful. واستوثق أي طلب الثقة, right? Was more careful. لكتاب الصحيح أكثر مفهوم مطلق من مسلم رحمه الله تعالى. ويكون مذهب الإمام إمام علي بن المديني رحمه الله تعالى إلى التشدد أقرب. وتكون غضبة مسلم وشدته موجهة إليه والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم. Right, they talk about Ali al-Madini. That's one. Then 140. He says فاستفيد, where are we? فاستفيد أي تعلم what can learn from this من هذه كله أن مسلما لما صاحب البخاري في نيسابور وأدام الاختلاف إليه spent a lot of time in it التردد الاختلاف إليه meaning التردد إليه ولازمه كل الملازمة خمس سنوات من سنة 250 إلى سنة 55 كان منتهيا من تأليف he had already finished Sahih Muslim, right? So he already finished it. وفيه مقدمة التي فيها كلام شديد. He already finished it anyway. So before he met Bukhari, for that long time, he'd already finished his work, and he'd already written his rebuttal of Ali Madini. He wasn't talking about Bukhari anyway. فلا يعقل أبدا أن يكون البخاري هو المعني بهذه اللهجة الشديدة. Right? This lahja, usually like a way of dialect. It means this kind of language is very, very harsh. التي لا تطاق معها مقابلة ولا لقاء فضلا عن الصحبة والملازمة. So if you were to write something like that, you couldn't even sit with somebody who wrote something like that about, right? Let alone, so he's talking about Ali Madini, he's not talking about Bukhari. Okay, so is that clear with everybody? Is it practical? No, it's not practical. It's not actually a discussion at all. It's there, mashallah, jazakum khair. Sometimes we have these things in our room, but it's not such a big deal. What time are we on? Let's try and go back to where we were. On page 45. On page 45, it says ثم إن كان المدلس عن شيخه ذا تدليس عن الثقات فلا بأس. It says it's not a really big deal. The issue is that you narrate, basically, you are Farid Dingle, right? You go to California after being in Jordan for 20 years. And everyone's like, oh, you used to live next to Sheikh Noor. Tell us about Sheikh Noor. So I'm saying all these things from Sheikh Noor, right? But half of it I didn't even hear him say anyway. Half of it is from random people in Jordan that are nobodies. These are du'afa. And so I'm just trying to say lots of things, and it's not very useful because some of it as I heard from Sheikh Noor, some of it I didn't. And I'm just saying, oh, we heard Sheikh Noor, meaning we, not myself, and meaning other people. Okay, are these people good or bad? It's a problem, right? And so again, what do we do? Well, it's not, things are not so black and white. What do we have to do, as inshallah I've mentioned many times, is we have to get into the granular details of this narrator. So when I'm looking up a narrator, I don't just say, is he a thiqa or not? Is he a mudallis or not? It's not like that. What I have to do is look specifically at this narrator, specifically narrating from that person. Right? Sometimes you have this person's a thiqa and that person's a thiqa, but this hadith is a mistake. How do I know that? Muhaddithin pointed it out. Sometimes it's this person's good, but he's a mudallis, but this particular narrator is not, he didn't do tadlis from. Or that particular narrator, he did definitely do tadlis from. Right? And it's problematic. For example, فَإِذَا قَالَ الْوَلِيدِ ibn Muslim or Baqiyya ibn, who is it? So this is Walid ibn Muslim and Walid and Baqiyya ibn Walid. It's a bit confusing because they both have the word Walid in it. Right? So these are two Damascans. They often narrate from the Awza'i. They did narrate from Awza'i. Right? They did narrate from Awza'i. But so it's not an issue of ittisal or not. But the issue is they frequently narrate from Awza'i indirectly. Fawahin. So if they say an Baqiyya ibn Walid, Walid ibn Muslim, they say an, hold your horses. You've got to check what's going on. فواهن فإنهما يدلسان كثيرا عن الهلكاء, really bad narrators. ولهذا يتقي أصحاب الصحاح حديث الوليد فما جاء إسناده بصيغة عن ابن جريج أو عن الأوزاعي تجنبوه. Right? They completely ignored it. I don't know if we have enough time left. We don't have another lesson. Inshallah, we'll come back to this. For next week, if you can have a look at the Muqaddimah, and I have the link here. I said send the link right now, or is this? The Muqaddimah of, yeah. The Muqaddimah of Tabaqat and Mudallisin. So please have a look at this. I'm pasting it right now in the chat. Of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Okay, just the Muqaddimah, the first page. Right, so please read that for next week, inshallah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Subhanallah bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.